The following game by Sergei Karjakin is one of my favourites of the whole of this DVD, and that is for a number of reasons, but the main one being that in August 2002, where this tournament in Sudak was played in Ukraine, helped secure Sergei his third and final Grandmaster norm, an outstanding achievement for someone aged just 12 years and 7 months. And this has helped put him in the record-breaking books as the youngest ever Grandmaster in the history of chess. This record, 10 years later, still stands. Many players have come close, 13-year-olds, 13-and-a-half-year-olds. But no one has actually managed to do it under the age of 13. And the game played against Anna Ushenina, who actually currently, 10 years after this game was played, is the current Women's World Champion in 2013. So she's obviously a very strong player. And it was the way he won this game as well. Clearly, he knew the pressure upon him to try and fulfill that third Grandmaster norm. So it was an outstanding, perfect game he played here in the third round. And unsurprisingly, it was from one of his favourite openings, the Sicilian Najdorf. So here we see the open Sicilian and then the Sicilian Najdorf. And it followed his game against Kononenko we saw in Chapter 2, with Bishop e2, the classical variation, and now e5. And the moves actually followed exactly the same, except White played King h1. Now, I've actually looked at this variation, and although we saw in that game with Kononenko in Game 2 how Karjakin had played Bishop e6 and Knight d7, because White has not played f4 yet, Black actually has an alternative method of developing that bishop on c8. And that is to play b6 and bishop b7. And that is actually a slightly better variation to play here, since White will have some problems defending this e4 pawn. So Karjakin obviously knows his openings. He studied his openings very hard. Again, this is an example of that. He knows the difference between the subtle moves like King h1 or Bishop e3, and he's going to play very flexibly. So b6. Now he could have played b5 in one go, but that allows White to try and do something about that pawn. For example, a4, b4, Knight d5. This might be a little bit more problematic. In fact, this has been played and it's completely fine for Black. But Black has to worry about the pawn. Black has to worry about White playing a5 and trying to come in on b6. And finally, if Black now tries to take on e4, trying to take advantage of all of this, then Bishop f3 is a very strong move. And the point is that after Black does something with the knight, for example Bishop f5 to protect, White has moves like Queen e1. And the problem for Black is this knight. If it ever moves, there's going to be a discovery down here towards the long diagonal on the rook on a8. So whilst b5 is actually a playable move, I'm going to say that b6 is slightly more safer. So now a4 won't really achieve anything. Black will just continue with Bishop b7. So a slightly safer variation. So f4 and Bishop b7, attacking the pawn on e4, Bishop f3, Knight d7. Now we've talked about Knight d7 being the move to play rather than Knight c6. And the point is that Black will now attempt to play b5 and Knight b6, which again we saw in Game 2. Why do we want to do that? Well, it controls these two key squares here. They're very important Najdorf squares. They're also central squares, so it makes a lot of sense in order to play that. Now, White has choices to make, but Anna Ushenina decided to play f5. Now that releases the tension in the centre, but it also gives White this option of playing a very typical Sicilian idea in these kind of positions, which is to try and smash Black with g4 and g5. Now we've talked about whether pushing the g-pawn or that is a sensible idea. Well, it's sensible if you control the centre, and I think that she can claim that she does control the centre, because most of those squares are covered by White minor pieces and pawns. So g4, g5 will be quite a nice way to try and attack this knight on f6. So what can Black do about that? Well, Karjakin started with b5. And after g4, for example, it's too early for g4 here, because after b4, there is going to be some pressure on this square. So White would have to play knight d5 as the only move to defend the e-pawn. But after something like, for example, knight takes d5 and a5, it's unclear as to whether g4 was really a good move, because now g5 isn't really a threat. In fact, black can just take it with the bishop on e7. And in the meantime, black has some play on the queen side. And finally, the pawn on d5 blocks white's potential, attacking on the d6 pawn, the backward d6 pawn, the hallmark of the Najdorf Sicilian structure. So all in all, we can probably say that black is completely fine here, maybe even better. So, with that g4 plan in mind, Ushenina played a3. You're told as a Sicilian player that you shouldn't really be scared of that move, and this game is no exception. Although the move does have its points, as we said, it prevents b4. So, rook c8, a sensible move, and now g4 comes. So if black's not careful, this idea of g5 is going to be very strong. And Karjakin played a very thematic idea here, and it's one to know in many Sicilian positions. In fact, it's a common idea in many opposite side castling positions as well. What can black do to try and counterattack against this idea? And Karjakin played rook takes c3, a thematic exchange sacrifice. The point is that after the rook is captured, knight takes e4. Black gets a pawn for the exchange. The idea of g5 is lessened, and also the black bishop could potentially be quite strong down towards the king on h1. So g4 has now been considered as a weakening move, if you could say that, because white now has to watch out for the king's position here. If you compare that to the black king on g8, pretty secure. On the other hand, it's white's position. So I think black has full compensation for the exchange. Also, the knight is eyeing up these weak pawns here as well. So white's structure on the queen's side has been damaged. So a lot of compensation here. Queen e1, which defends the pawn and attacks the knight on e4. Bishop h4. This is quite a nice little move as well. And it proves that if the pawn was on g2, white could actually play g3 and win a piece, because both the pieces would be hanging. But of course g4 has been played, and pawns cannot go backwards. So the queen had to move, and d5. Well, apparently knight f6 was even stronger. If I just give a computer variation to demonstrate that, knight takes g4. That's an excellent idea, trying to utilize that bishop on b7. And after king g1, knight takes g4, it's clear that white is in big trouble. This bishop is an absolute monster down towards the white king on these squares. And wherever white moves the queen, for example queen a7, potentially black can put the queen on c6 and use the queen to come in down here. So the white king is extremely drafty here. So that was maybe a little bit stronger, but we'll forgive Sergei for his play here. It's still very impressive. d5, a4, it's hard to recommend anything for white, and sensible chess queen c7. So bringing the queen in, helping to bring the rook in, maybe down towards the c file. Very easy play for black here. So although the knight was captured, there's still some problems for white. The queen cannot move on e3 because the bishop would look down towards the king, which is something that actually ends the game later on. And white has very little coordination. The rooks are not connected on f1 and a4. The bishop on c1 doesn't really have a very good square to go to. Neither does the knight on b3. So the initiative is certainly with black. And we've seen already Karjakin is very strong in these types of positions where he has the initiative. Very much suits his style. h6, a sensible move of course. Preventing g5, stopping any back rank checkmates. Knight a5. Do we want to allow white to take the bishop? No. Bishop a8. And here we see some moves. Rook a1. There goes another pawn. And it's no surprise in this position that white just folded. I think white could have made a bit more of a stab at it. Maybe something like bishop a3. But I think after something like rook d8, there's still some problems for white. But in the game, queen h3 was played, and this allowed a lovely tactical finish. Now, if you've been listening to what I've been talking about the bishop on a8, it should be fairly obvious as to what black's generic plan will be here now to try and utilise that idea. e3, and a very nice move, sacrificing the bishop on h4, but clearing the way for the queen to come in, and with devastating effect on these squares, the queen will come in with checkmate, and there's nothing that white can do about it. So, an excellent game there from Karjakin. As I said, probably one of my favourite ones that he's played because of the way he crushed a very strong opponent. Very thematic. He showed his opening, he showed his tactics, very much his style, and I think that demonstrates the play that he was able to do at the age of just 12 years. So, Karjakin securing his third Grandmaster norm in the Sudak tournament of August 2002 and becoming the youngest ever Grandmaster in chess history.